皆様、こんにちは。本日のフォーラムにお越しいただきまして、心より感謝申し上げます。定刻となりましたので、始めさせていただきます。私、本日の進行役を務めます。読売新聞東京本社調査研究本部の笹澤でございます。本日はこの1年にわたって開催してきました読売国際会議、高まる脅威と日本の課題という年間テーマでやってきましたけれども、これを締めくくる最後の討論会となります。本日はですね、台湾とウクライナ、挑戦する権威主義と題しまして、アメリカ・スタンフォード大学の日本訪問団の協力を得まして、2部構成で討論いたします。第1部なんですけれども、皆さんご覧のように左ですね、アメリカ・スタンフォード大学フリーマン・スポグリ国際問題研究所のオリアナ・マストロさんです。それから、モデレーターとしてパシフィック・イニシアティブ API プレジデントで慶応大学教授の神保健さん。そして、今、中央移りました。こちらはですね、今日はリモートで参加になりますけれども、同じくアメリカ・スタンフォード大学FSI フリーマン・スポグリ国際問題研究所ディレクターのマイケル・マクフォールさん。
Who is the director of Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. Can you hear me, Professor McFaul?
Yeah, welcome. Your participation. 第2部なんですけれども、一応ここでご紹介しておきますけれども、スタンフォード大学 FSI よりフランシス・クヤマさん、ラリー・ダイヤモンドさん、それからモデレーターとしてスタンフォード大学教授の筒井清輝さんが登壇し、第2部の討論を行います。討論にはそれぞれ1時間、質疑に15分程度を見込んでおります。なお、ご覧のようにですね、向かって壇上左側にございますけれども、同時通訳のレシーバーは日本語が1チャンネル、英語の方が2チャンネルになっております。なお、本日のフォーラムですけれども、読売新聞社、アジアパシフィックイニシアティブ、そしてスタンフォード大学ジャパンプログラムの3社の共催で行います。会場の傍聴されている皆さんからも質問もお受けいたしますので、ふるってご参加ください。それでは、第1部に移りたいと思います。モデレーターのジンボさんにマイクをお預けします。
はい、ジンボでございます。本日はよろしくお願いいたします。国際文化会館、そしてアジアパシフィックイニシアティブを代表して、
On behalf of these two sponsors, I would like to thank all of you for joining us for the forum.
アジアパシフィックイニシアティブと国際文化会館、
Asia Pacific Initiative and iHouse have merged together in April last year. So as a think tank, we would like to further strengthen our program and projects going forward. And it so happened that we were indeed very privileged to have eminent professors from Stanford University, 4 speakers, and we very much wanted to have the forum to have a good discussion with the many participants. As was introduced earlier, part 1, we will be taking up Ukraine and Taiwan, those shocking events. It's been about a year since Russia has invaded Ukraine. And with what is happening in Ukraine and what may be the implications to this region, including Taiwan, we would like to have in-depth discussion. So it's been almost 1 year since the incursion by Russia, which has shaken the very foundation of the international order. On the other hand, Europe and the United States have been able to deepen their strategic partnership, and including Japan, many countries have joined in imposing sanctions over Russia. We have seen the dire developments in the past 12 months. The Ukrainian people are commendable in fighting against Russia to defend their dignity and sovereignty. There are many lessons that we will be able to learn from their experience. On the other hand, the international community, as we watch Russia invading Ukraine, how can we impose higher cost on Russia so that Russia will be able to recognize and conclude that their invasion has been a strategic error and mistake, but we have not yet arrived at that end stage. We are still watching how the situation may unfold going forward. We would like to have a good debate on this. Another topic is, of course, Taiwan. At the last series of conference on Yomiuri Forum has also discussed Taiwan. There is rising tension because of the Chinese behavior. There has been the 20th Party Convention of the Chinese Communist Party, which has led to new leadership being announced. And in Taiwan, the new president of the Democratic Party has been chosen, and next year there will be presidential election to be held. So, based upon the lessons learned from Ukraine, how should we address this Taiwan question is what we would like to discuss today. So, on a virtual basis, it is most unfortunate that Professor McFaul is not be able to be amongst us. But next time, I very much hope that Professor McFaul will be able to visit Japan soon. Now, I would like to ask Professor McFaul, first of all, up until 2011, from 2014, under the Obama administration, he has been ambassador to Russia. He is an expert on Russia. And looking at the Ukrainian war, the Russian invasion, it's been almost a year. So from Ambassador McFaul, from your perspective, what may be the strategic lessons that we have learned from the Russian-Ukrainian situation? And what may be the structure of deterrence and defense of Europe from the U.S. perspective? What has been the impact and changes, please?
Well, first of all, thank you, Professor Jimbo, for having me and everybody. And it's good to see Oriana on the screen and the back of the heads of my colleagues as well. I apologize. I was planning to be with you, and I avoided COVID in 2020. I avoided COVID in 2021 and 2022, but I did not avoid COVID in 2023. So that's why I'm not with you, but I look forward to being with you in the spring or summertime in the future. This is a very crucial time in the world when we're thinking about issues of deterrence. Having just witnessed a historic meeting here in Washington between our leaders, between our Japanese leadership and American leadership, I look forward to the discussion that you'll have about the implications of deterrence in our bilateral relationship with respect to Taiwan. But you asked me a different question. You asked me to reflect on deterrence and the state of the war in Europe. And I think the first observation, it's an obvious one, but I think we need to remember it before we get to all the great things that the United States and NATO and, of course, Ukrainian warriors have done on the battlefield in Ukraine, is to first start by acknowledging that deterrence failed. We did not deter Russia from invading Ukraine for a second time in 2022. We failed at deterrence back in 2014 when they first invaded Ukraine. And I think we could go back all the way to Georgia in 2008 and also say that deterrence failed then. So I think when we're looking for lessons for what to learn from Ukraine with respect to security issues and deterrence in Asia, I think we have to start with why did deterrence fail in 2022? And I would say two or three things to that before talking about where we are at the war right now. First, Mr. Putin went on in his view, for his perception, I want to emphasize, not my perception, but from his perception, Mr. Putin used military force several times before 2022, and he got away with it. So you could go all the way back to the war in Chechnya, when he used force in 1999-2000, but especially Georgia then 2008, again Ukraine 2014. I would add to that list Syria in 2015 when he deployed his Air Force to help keep in power Mr. Assad. And in all of those instances, he took big risks in using military force, and in the three latter cases abroad in foreign countries, and he was struck by the successes in his view of using military force and the lack of reaction from the West. After 2014, let's not go back to those earlier cases, but after 2014, when he invaded Ukraine, there were sanctions, but relatively modest sanctions. There was no military assistance. And so he learned the lesson from that, that maybe if he did use military force again in 2022, there would be not a very big military response and not a big economic response. And so I think if we think about how to make deterrence more effective with respect to Taiwan, I think it's important to remember that we did not make those credible commitments to deterrence before 2022. And when we get to Oriana and talk about Taiwan, I think we should think about concrete ways that you can enhance deterrence before, rather than waiting for military action to begin. So that's the first thing I would say about the run-up to the war. Number two, I would remind everybody that doesn't think about Putin as long as I have. I met Mr. Putin back in 1991, so we go way back. I've written a lot about him, and for 5 years when I served in the Obama administration, I met him many times. I think it's important to remember about Mr. Putin that he is very motivated by ideology, by a set of ideas about the world that trumps other kind of, security considerations or economic considerations. And I think one of the mistakes we made in the run-up to the war was thinking, well, this is irrational. He would never do something so dangerous or so audacious as to invade, let alone try to annex territory, because we were imposing our cost-benefit analysis on the way that he thinks. And Putin does not think like us. He is motivated by different things. And I'm happy to go in more of that later in questions. The one thing I want everybody to remember, that this was not a defensive war to stop NATO expansion. This was a war to try to correct wrongs that go back in Putin's mind hundreds of years, to try to reunite, in Putin's view, nations that were divided, the Ukrainians and Russians. He doesn't believe they're different peoples. That is the crux of what motivated him to invade, and it was not these short-term calculations about security or economic interests. But then third, and I'll end with this, but happy obviously to answer more questions, I think the other lesson is that he gravely miscalculated in many different fronts. Number one, he overcalculated in terms of the power of his own military capabilities. Remember, before February 24th, 2022, most military analysts in the world, well, I shouldn't say the world, because I'm in an international forum. Most military analysts that I know here in the United States of America, including academics, including those that work in the CIA, including our top military experts on Russia in the US government, assumed that the Russian military was one of the top three most capable militaries in the world. United States, China, Russia, that was always the ranking. And if you added up the numbers of how many soldiers they had, how many tanks they had, how much money they spent on military as a percentage of their GDP, Russia looked on paper of having a lot of military capability. We now know that we overestimated that Mr. Putin, in part because of the capabilities he had, in part because of bad strategy, and in part because of underestimating his enemy, the Ukrainian armed forces, that we overestimated the Russian military, excuse me. Number two, I just alluded to it. We underestimated the Ukrainian military. We don't have a lot of experts on Ukrainian military, by the way, in the United States. It was striking to me in the run-up to the war in all the conversations I was in, including with senior government officials, including from time to time the President of the United States, how shallow our knowledge was about Ukrainian military capabilities. We had a ton of experts on Russia. We didn't have as many on Ukraine. And I think, therefore, we underestimated their capabilities in two respects. One, we forgot that the Ukrainians had been fighting since 2014. I think that's another big distinction when we get to the comparison with Taiwan, but they've been fighting a war. They did not begin fighting the Russians in 2022. They've been fighting since 2024, from 2014, training, including with the California National Guard to get better, and had greater capabilities than I think we assumed. And then third, Mr. Putin underestimated the response of the United States and NATO on the military side, and I would say the global community of democratic states, including Japan, on the economic side. They did not expect that we would be giving billions of dollars in military assistance to the Ukrainians as fast as we did. They did not expect that many countries would be a part of this coalition, not just the United States. And on the economic side, they did not expect the comprehensive sanctions regime in place today, the most comprehensive sanctions regime implemented against another country in the history of sanctions, I believe, and most certainly in recent history in the last 30 years. And so that miscalculation, I think, has led to major Russian military defeats on the battlefield. They lost the Battle of Kiev. They lost the battle around Kharkiv, the second largest city of Ukraine. The Ukrainian warriors then liberated Kherson and have now rolled back 50% of the territories that the Russians have taken. And so that, I think, was surprising for Mr. Putin. But I'll end on this first question with a question mark about the future. I think 2022 will be remembered as a year of victory for the Ukrainian armed forces and a year of defeat for the Russian armed forces. That doesn't mean that 2023 or 2024 will also be that way. I think it's very uncertain what happens in the future with respect to the way this war plays out. Maybe we'll get to that with the next question. But victory in 2022 does not ensure victory in 2023.
Ambassador McFaul, thank you very much. Thank you so much for a thought-provoking discussion now. For many years, President Putin has been analyzed by you, Ambassador McFaul, and that is why you can say that Russia continues to underestimate, and we tend to overestimate Russian capabilities. You have unpacked that analysis for us. Thank you so much. Now, continuing on, I have another question for Ambassador McFaul, which is what you had said at the end. What about the future? What is going to be the development in the future? In 2022, Ukrainians have resisted, and in a sense, they have scored a tactical victory. But in 2023, is this going to be, or this is not likely to promise, this isn't a promise for victory in 2023. Then, if that is so, this Ukraine war, how is it going to come to an end? How could we see a scenario of this war coming to an end? How can you paint that scenario in your view? And President Putin and Kremlin, how they would withdraw from this war? How can they make a conclusion of withdrawing from this war? What is your assessment, Ambassador McFaul?
Those are impossible questions to answer. They're too hard. Ask some easier ones, please. In all seriousness, I've been reading for an article I'm writing right now, all the assessments of the war back in January and February, and having read how badly we got those wrong, I am not brave enough to try to predict the future today. because it is shocking how bad our assessments were, the assessments we made a year ago compared to today. But let me say a few things with that caveat as a preambular statement. Right now, the Ukrainians believe that momentum is on their side. I speak to Ukrainian government officials rather frequently. I just did yesterday to senior Ukrainian officials, and their assessment is that this is the equivalent of 1943 in World War II. That is after the Battle of Stalingrad that the Soviets won, with Ukrainian soldiers too there, by the way. Momentum had shifted, and it was just a matter of time until they knew that the Soviet Union was going to defeat Nazi Germany on the Eastern Front. But remember, between 1943 and 45, there were many battles and lots of people died and lots of destruction. But that is their mindset. They believe that the momentum is now on their side, but they also understand that it's going to be a long fight before they liberate all of their territories. And without question, they are still focused on that goal. Whether that's right or wrong, analysts, we can debate, but I think it's important for people to understand that they are not trying to fight to get back to the February 24th borders. They are firmly focused on trying to liberate all of Donbass and the Crimea, To do so, however, they believe that they need new offensive military capabilities to achieve that objective. And therefore, whether they succeed or not will depend on NATO and will depend on the United States. There are three weapon systems in particular that they're focused on: tanks, fighter aircraft, jet fighters, and long-range missile systems. ATACMS are what they're called. And they believe that if they are provided those kinds of weapons in the numbers that they need, they can achieve victory in 2023. I'm not a military expert, but I want you to understand their mindset. Conversely, if you look at what Mr. Putin is saying, I think he believes time is on his side. He is not in as a big a rush in 2023 as what I hear from the Ukrainian side. He believes that if he can fight to a stalemate in 2023 and just be basically at the same place as they are today, the West and the international community of democratic states will begin to lose interest in the war. They are banking on the fact that there are already signs in my country, for instance, within the Republican Party, that there are critics of how much assistance we are providing to the Ukrainians. The last major package, it was $45 billion, was passed back in December, just a month ago, but that's when the Democrats still controlled the House of Representatives. The Russian thinking is that if they can hold on and keep fighting to a stalemate, and they're preparing for their surges and they're preparing to draft more soldiers, but I think they think the longer the war goes, the more likelihood that the West will give up on Ukraine, and that's when they will be able to do what is now, I believe, Putin's minimalist objective, which is to seize de facto the 4 territories that he annexed on paper back in September. Those are the 4 eastern regions of Ukraine that he declared in a ceremony in September as being now part of Russia. And so I don't have the courage to predict which 2 of those scenarios are true, but I hear a sense of urgency on the Ukrainian side. I hear a sense of time is on their side from the Russian side.
Thank you very much. Time is going to favor whom? That's the question, and how the future would develop. I think this could be a war of our perceptions. This is a very important point in formulating our view on the war. Now, in this hall with us, we have Dr. Oriana Mastro. So let us start the discussion with Dr. Mastro. As you know, Dr. Mastro is an expert on military strategy, both on the US as well as in China. She has written in various journals, including Foreign Affairs. She has been voicing her opinions in various outlets. So I'd like to ask Dr. Oriana Mastro. Xi Jinping has entered into his third term, and the positioning of Taiwan, how is it likely to change? How do you view the possibility of changing the positioning of the Taiwan issue in the Xi Jinping administration? Politburo personnel appointments have been made newly. You have a new lineup, and Central Military Commission also has a new leadership team, and Taiwan continues to be their core strategic target. Currently, Dr. Oriana Mastro, how do you assess the situation today?
Well, thank you for that question, and thank you for having me here. I was doing a review of my photos in my photo library to remind myself of the last time I was in Japan, and it was about 10 years ago. I tried to think of all the things that had changed in the past 10 years, and until COVID and until the decrease in relations between China and the United States, I spent most of my free time in China. And now I'm much more interested in learning more about allies and partners. And so I really appreciate the invitation to be here to speak today. There's a few points that I want to make about Xi Jinping and China's Taiwan policy. And then I will pick up on something that Mike said about how to enhance deterrence. And I'll give you my 3 points that I think we need to keep in mind when enhancing deterrence against China. The Taiwan contingency. There was nothing surprising to me about the Party Congress. There's nothing surprising to me about Xi Jinping most of the time. And the things that Xi Jinping says, how he acts, I think from very early on, in 2013, he was very clear that enhancing China's role on the international stage was going to be a key part of the legitimacy of the Communist Party moving forward. And their understanding of enhancing that legitimacy is also about standing up to the bullying of that foreigners put onto China and achieving their territorial integrity as they define it. I often say people ask me because I talk about conflict, if I have any issues in China. I have frequent interactions now on Zoom, but hopefully soon in person with the party, with the military. There is nothing that I say about the fact that they want to take Taiwan and will take it by force that is controversial in Beijing. It's only controversial, not so much now, but maybe a few years ago when I started talking about the prospect for a war over Taiwan. It's really only controversial to the rest of the world that has seemed to have forgotten how politics works. And me and Mike will disagree, and we'll have a discussion maybe about the lessons China has learned or should learn from Ukraine. But one lesson I hope everyone has learned is that governments and leaders in particular are still willing to fight wars and use force to gain territory that they feel is integral to their understanding of their power. So if anyone had any doubts about that before, I hope those doubts have been resolved. At the Party Congress, Xi Jinping, as was mentioned, elevated certain military leaders to the Central Military Commission, which is the central decision-making body for military affairs. What was interesting but not surprising is that he elevated people with extensive expertise in the joint operational domain and with Taiwan contingencies. From the regions of China that focus on those contingencies, one of the members that was elevated to vice chairman has experience in the Joint Operations Center. It is not surprising. In Chinese media, they very openly call the Central Military Commission the Taiwan clique. It is a group of people who are continuing the focus that has been the focus for 25 years on building a military that can take Taiwan by force. Now, I don't think Xi Jinping needs Taiwan to stay in power. This isn't an argument about weakness. It's not an argument that, he feels pressure domestically, pressure from other elites. He has to do it in this term or he's going to be thrown out. There are many other factors that will determine whether Xi Jinping gets another term. Of course, if he successfully, in the Chinese terminology, reunifies, he's guaranteed to continue power. But I think, and this is an important distinction, the motivation is to do it, if you can do it, to do it as soon as possible. Because you never know, as Professor McFaul said, you never know what the future holds. And we can sit potentially in Stanford or in Tokyo and try to weigh the balance of power and say, well, China can wait, you know, they'll still be, will they be powerful economically? What's the military balance of power in the 2030s? But this is the most important issue for the Communist Party. They are long-term in their thinking. The issue is that we are at the end of the long term. It's been over 70 years, and they've been planning for this moment. So the premise is that Xi Jinping is easily deterrable. He doesn't have to do it. There's no closing window of opportunity, but China wants Taiwan. So what does that mean for our approach to deter him? There's three main things I keep in mind when I assess and provide guidance on U.S. defense policy that I want to use to provide guidance today on Japanese defense policy. So I will say, I know there's that discomfort between a foreigner who knows nothing about Japan coming here to lecture you about your defense policy. So I just want to assure you that I lecture everybody about everything. You can ask my senior colleagues at Stanford. I have no shame in telling everyone that they need to be doing things differently. And these points are one that I have recently made at the highest levels of the U.S. defense establishment. So you are not alone in the three things I'm about to say. I know that, and I am too, very positive about the changes Japan has made, about increase in defense spending, the enhanced coordination between our militaries. The United States has also made significant changes in how we do business in Asia. But I'm not sure any of it matters unless we meet three conditions. The first one is whatever we do in the defense realm has to have an operational impact. So I say this to the U.S. military all the time. They say, Oriana, you know, we're deterring China. We sailed these aircraft carriers through, you know, near the Taiwan Strait, enhances deterrence. Interesting. If a war breaks out, what are those carriers going to do? They're going to leave. So if those carriers have no impact on preventing China from taking Taiwan in a wartime scenario, they do not deter China. And along those lines, from the Japanese point of view, enhancing your defense of the Senkakus does nothing to deter China from taking Taiwan. Unless Japanese operations are going to be involved directly in stopping a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, it's not going to have the impact that you think it will. So even in the United States, we say, oh, but we're doing so much more. If in the end China still calculates that they can take Taiwan quickly and successfully before the United States, Japan, any countries can intervene significantly, we're in the same position today than we were before all these changes. The second point, which seems obvious, is China has to know about any changes that are made. Often, we get this picture that no one wants to upset China. So I'll get reassured, both at the Pentagon and here in Tokyo. Don't worry, we're doing all the right things. We're just keeping it super secret. If the Chinese don't know about any of it, it does not enhance deterrence. They are still not taking it into account. And what we do in peacetime says a lot about what you'll do in wartime. So I often have gotten reassured, don't worry, when the war actually starts, Japan is definitely in. But it's too late. At that point, we're fighting the largest war maybe the world has ever seen. So if in peacetime, the Japanese military, is not engaging in Taiwan Straits transits with the United States, it's reassuring that in wartime we might be fighting together, but if there's no indication in peacetime that that's the case, it does not enhance deterrence. And the last point I want to make, and this again seems obvious, anything we want to do to deter has to happen before the war starts. Again, it seems like an obvious point, but the view that, for example, the Japanese public will support, don't worry, I'm told, don't worry. Once the war starts, the Japanese public will be supportive. Again, too late. There has to be signs. We have to let the Chinese know now that there is that support. There was a series of writings in Chinese journals after the invasion of Ukraine in which they talked about the failure of deterrence and how Russia did not expect the level of sanctions that occurred. And there were a lot of kind of indirect pleas in these Chinese writings that said, if the picture is different than what we currently assess the United States, you should probably let us know sometime soon. Because their assessment is that the economic, political, and military costs are going to be acceptable. And while there's progress towards how we talk about Taiwan, how we're thinking about this issue, fundamentally and operationally, nothing has changed to a degree that makes me think that we've resolved this issue.
Thank you very much. It was quite stimulating discussion. Now, for Dr. Mastro, in relation to what you have just said, I have a follow-up question. In the first point, you mentioned about the U.S. The aircraft carrier strike group was mentioned, but what may happen in the contingency may be quite different from what will happen as expected during the peace time. The three services, or the first services of the U.S. military for the A2AD, within the A2AD, they are trying to think about the scenario and strategy to fight the war inside the A2AD zone. So within the A2AD zone, they are thinking hard about how can they continue to fight and how can Japan be able to enhance the level of joint operation with the U.S. forces. What is your assessment, Dr. Mastro? U.S. looking at the Chinese modernization of their military, do you think that U.S. is doing properly in terms of the necessary investment? Do you think that they are aptly formulating the way to fight as a scenario for the future? Or do you think that the U.S. is far behind when it comes to these things?
I give a talk often at the Pentagon in which I try to explain why the United States is doing so little and so late. To me, it's the biggest mystery of all of this. I spend so much time talking about the threat, talking about the sense of urgency, and then you actually look at what's being done, and we are far from doing enough. I'm obviously here speaking in my civilian capacity, and my views do not represent those of the U.S. government, the United States Air Force, or the United States Department of Defense. But in my military job, I spent 13 years trying to deal with this issue of fighting within the A2AD envelope, and we have resolved nothing in 13 years. We cannot defend our bases. I spent years at the Pentagon working on base resiliency efforts. How can we make it so even if China attacks Kadena, we can defend Kadena? We can't. Same with Guam. They're easily saturated by Chinese missiles. I am often asked, how do we enhance deterrence in space? Keep China from attacking our space assets. Keep China from attacking Kadena. Keep them from attacking our ships. The only thing I can come up with is what I call kind of operational resilience. It's extremely attractive for China to attack us in these ways because of how great the impact is on our ability to operate. Right? So right now, the only airfield, the only base we have in the combat range of Taiwan is Kadena. We have one. You shoot a bunch of missiles at Kadena, the United States Air Force can no longer operate, establish air superiority. The Navy surface fleet, therefore, is not coming, so China wins the war. You blind our satellites, we can't talk, China wins the war. So the only things I can think of is trying to create resilience, and that can be more redundancy. But more and more, I think that's about including allies and partners, because China is extremely concerned about widening this war. They only win Taiwan if the war is short, it's geographically limited to Taiwan, and only involves the United States, potentially in Taiwan. So I am convinced that if Japan were to commit to fight with the United States in this contingency, that would be enough to deter China, because the aggregation of our forces outmatch China's, but more importantly, the geography. Someone over dinner yesterday said to me, you know, they were worried. They said, well, you know, Oriana, it takes our submarines 2 to 3 days to get there. It takes our submarines 3 to 4 weeks to get there. And so even if most of the fighting is going to happen with the United States and China, the bottom line is the most useful thing is that Japan has to hold the Chinese off in the immediate beginning of the war to give the United States time to get there. So I have this meeting with some former secretaries of defense the day we land, and so I have this document of what do we need to do, because I often get asked, how do we convince China they can't do this? What should our communication strategy be? And I always say, well, first, it actually has to be true. We'll probably be better off convincing them of something that's true. So the United States needs more platforms. Then we need munitions for those platforms. We do not have even close to enough munitions to even put a dent in the invading force that's coming across the strait. We have to be able to be flexible about when the war starts. So this means that, you know, I think Xi Jinping is going to start moving the invading force before he launches a missile campaign against Taiwan. Politically, we're all limited in what we can do until the war actually starts, and so we have to be agile in that. And then we need more places to operate from, access, basing, and overflight, and we need our allies and partners to be behind us. Once we get those 4 things in line, then the 5th one is to make sure China knows that U.S. and allied capability has changed. But the Chinese aren't stupid, and they're not easily tricked, so I don't think we can convince them that there's been a significant change in our capabilities to operate in this A2AD envelope unless we actually make changes to make that true.
ありがとうございます。ここからはですね、ぜひこのウクライナと台湾の双方の関係について少し聞いてみたいと思います。特にヨーロッパ、ロシアを専門にしている
Russian Ambassador McFaul, you're an expert on Russia. How do you view the strategic environment in Asia? And Oriana, you're an expert in Asia. What are the lessons that can be learned from Ukraine? Those are the questions that I want to put to you. Ambassador McFaul, in your initial remarks, you've said that the first thing that we need to recognize is that we failed in deterring Russia, and we failed many times before. That is what you said earlier. So from here on, when we look at China, as Dr. Oriana Mastro said, there was a very severe assessment of the situation regarding China. So in order to avoid failing to deter China, what do we have to do now? Ambassador McFaul, as you look at the strategic environment in Asia through the lens of Ukraine, what are your assessments? What are the views that you have? Please. You're on mute.
Sorry, I was coughing. I didn't want you to hear me coughing. So sorry for being on mute. So great questions. I want to emphasize I'm not an expert on China or Taiwan or the US military, but I listened to Oriana a lot, and I agree with everything she said about deterrence. I think that is the lesson of failure of deterrence in Europe that should be done now with respect to how to avoid war concerning Taiwan. Think about what if instead of announcing a few weeks ago that the United States is going to send a Patriot battery, that 20 years ago, the United States sent Patriots or THAAD or Aegis SM-3 missiles that are on Aegis ships, or sometimes they're now in Romania and Poland. What if we had put in a multi-layered missile defense system many, many years ago, rather than trying to start right now? Think about how that may have changed Putin's thinking about invading. One of the things I think we all need to study, again, I'm not an expert, but listening to Ukrainians speak about this, is what we've learned about missile defenses, how useful cruise missiles are or not, how useful drones are or not, and what can be defended with different kinds of platforms. I think there's a lot that can be learned. And I think there's some misconceptions, particularly about cruise missiles, by the way, that if we learned, we might be able to enhance, especially those defensive capabilities now. Second, I would say the same thing about the offensive capabilities. The Ukrainians received a very important weapon. It's called a HIMARS. It's a medium-range missile system, multiple rocket launch system. It has changed a lot on the battlefield. But they didn't receive that before the war. They received it midstream during the war. And so the more of those kinds of systems that are in place ahead of time, you're obviously going to enhance deterrence. And third, I would add to that on the economic side. I was part of the negotiations, discussions as an outsider with colleagues of mine in the Biden administration about whether they should be specific about what economic sanctions they would impose if Russia invaded. And at the time, I was a proponent for announcing those ahead of time, along the lines of what Oriana said. It does no good after the fact. You don't deter anything if you do it after the fact. My argument was announce it ahead of time so that Putin will know exactly what we plan to do. One of the reasons I was a proponent of that, by the way, is I wanted to tie our own hands because I was worried that we might think, well, let's not do the most extreme measures. And so if you announce it ahead of time, you make your commitment to that more credible than not. But the reason that was given by White House officials to me why they did not want to do that is they worried that trying to have a debate about sanctions among the democratic states that were going to impose them ahead of time would show our divisions. And I'm just reporting that. I don't know whether that was right or wrong, but I think if there's a way on the economic side to say ahead of time of what we plan to do, that would be a lesson learned of failure from deterrence that we learned in Ukraine that we might achieve with respect to Taiwan and China. And then the last lesson, I alluded to it, but let me be more explicit about it. And I want to be careful here because I'm not an expert, but I did travel with Oriana and Larry, who's with you, to Taiwan over the summer. And what was striking to me, listening to Taiwan officials, senior officials, talk about their preparations for war compared to what the Ukrainians were doing for 8 years, it just struck me that the Ukrainians were way more prepared for this war than Taiwan is today. You know, simple things like military spending, training, 4 months versus a year versus 2 years. And as I already said, combat experience. So the more of that can be done ahead of time, I think is another important lesson in terms of deterrence. And then finally, I would just say, just to echo something Oriana said, that sometimes leaders can be motivated by ideas, ideologies, grievances from the past that will cause them to not worry about the consequences, the costly consequences of war, either with respect to soldiers, costs of war, or sanctions. But you want to present an argument about those costs, not just to try to sway Xi Jinping, but to think about all of Chinese society, all of Chinese economic actors, so that they know that this will be catastrophically costly for everyone. This will not be a limited war. It won't be something that'll just happen overnight. And I think engaging in that debate ahead of time can also enhance deterrence.
Thank you very much. That was quite interesting point that you have made just now. Now I would like to ask Oriana the same question. Naturally, the lessons to be learned from Ukrainian situation for us, be it Japan or US, must learn the lessons, but China, Xi Jinping and his team should also learn the lesson. So the question is on both. You could answer just one side, or you could also talk about China as well as US and Japan as well, please.
Thank you for that. I think there are many things that all sides should be learning, and I'm happy that you've asked also what lessons we should learn, because often I get the question, what lessons should China learn? And more specifically, what lessons should China learn from Russia's failures? And I often point out that we never ask what lessons the US military should learn from Russia's failures. In that we like to think of Ukraine as Taiwan and Russia as China, but the Chinese think about Russia as the United States, right? That has been great power in decline, that lashes out, that has large, bulky equipment, that doesn't have the resolve to fight the way the Ukrainians do. I mean, that's how China sees itself, right? The United States has aircraft carriers, they have DF-21Ds. Maybe the United States will fight, but they're not willing to pay the same costs the Chinese are. And so I think China is paying attention, but it isn't the case that the lessons they've learned are that their military can't do this, and they haven't learned the lesson that the cost would be too high for two reasons. The first is they also have seen the Russian military struggle. And there are sort of three main reasons, to simplify, why the Russian military has had difficulty. Munitions, command and control, and logistics. Now the Chinese, and in particular under Xi Jinping in 2013, Xi Jinping took a look at his military, and he did what Putin probably should have done before the invasion of Ukraine. He said, well, you guys have a lot of fancy stuff. I don't know if any of you know how to really use any of it well. He thought his forces were poorly trained. They were unable to engage in joint operations. There used to be these specials on Chinese TV to show the mobility of the force. That was just Chinese troops moving from one city to another city. And I used to say in my courses, if you need to make a big deal out of the fact that your military can move from one part of your country to another part of your country, all that says is how immobile you are. And so the Chinese recognized they had these challenges, and under the guidance of Xi Jinping, they've engaged in massive organizational reforms to improve. So the Joint Logistics Command was just set up, honing their command and control. So people often ask me, why hasn't China taken Taiwan yet? It really is because these organizational changes just were put into place about 2 years ago. And so now China wants to do a series of exercises to make sure that everything's the way it is. So if anything, it's not like Ukraine was shocking to them militarily, but it does highlight how important command and control and logistics are. I think that Taiwan was so important, they wanted to be sure that they had everything set anyway. Maybe now we can say they want to be extra sure that command and control and logistics are solid before we go. On the economic side, I think the Chinese felt like they had to put in some extra work to figure out, to make sure that countries were not going to severely sanction China in the event of an attack on Taiwan. I don't think, limited economic sanctions would be enough to deter Xi Jinping. I think we need a level of economic disengagement that would cause a depression in China. Not, a decrease in GDP growth, but sort of negative growth of 15, 20, 25% that first year to have any impact. And my understanding, talking to people in the region, is there's not a lot of appetite with countries to put that level of sanctions on China. China is not Russia, right? Singapore might proudly put sanctions on Russia, but they have less than $2 billion of trade with Russia, right, and 60 with China. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done there. And to Mike's point, we war game stuff all the time, right? Contingency plans, what is our military going to do? What is your military going to do? And it's my understanding that we don't go into that level of work in detail on the economic and diplomatic side, but maybe we should. I'll tell you the lessons that we should learn, and this is where you can tell that I get increasingly frustrated by these questions. There is no sense of real urgency about this. I know we all talk about how there's a new sense of urgency. Deterrence is expensive, and there's trade-offs. But there's one thing that is more expensive than deterrence, and that is major war. So when I hear, even in the United States and in Japan, the economic costs, Japanese and US businesses are not happy with the idea of A, B, and C. I briefed bankers for 3 days in New York recently. How many times they said to me, Oriana, but if there's a war over the Taiwan Strait, Teslas will be delayed. And I said, nobody cares about your Teslas. I'm sitting there looking at thousands, tens of thousands of people being killed and the prospect of nuclear war. I don't care about your Teslas. And yeah, you're just going to have to use your old iPhone for another couple years. You'll survive. Yes, there are economic costs to deterrence. Maybe many of our companies, both in the United States, Japan, want to be able to trade certain things, manufacture certain things in China. Well, I'm sorry, you can't. That time is over. The South Koreans don't want the United States to use our assets in South Korea to deter China. I'm sorry, South Korea. The strategic environment has changed. We should not be concerned about sparking this war. I hear this a lot in the United States too. What if we say something, we do something, and then we cause a war that didn't need to happen? The bottom line is there's no scenario in which China gets full control over Taiwan peacefully. On a good day, 6% of the people of Taiwan are willing to consider being a part of the PRC. This can only happen by force. So the question is, do we want a happy China that is undeterred or an unhappy China that's deterred? Those are our only two options. And so there's a lot of, I'll give you one last example. I recently was advising the US military that they need to have a certain plan, a certain war plan. And again, they said to me, Oriana, you don't understand anything about how wars are fought, It would take us 18 months to put together this plan. I said, okay, if China attacked Taiwan tomorrow, how long would it take you to put together the plan? 6 days? Then do it in 6 days. Let's start thinking about how to actually change the environment with the sense of urgency that we need. Because my biggest fear is that we're going to find ourselves in a major war, and it's not even the cost of the war, which will be massive. But, I go to China all the time. I have close interactions with Chinese colleagues. While I have a difference of opinion with the Chinese government on a number of issues, I understand their position on many of those issues. If I were Chinese, I'd be doing the same things. I don't think of any scenario in which we fight a major war with China and then any of us get to have any interaction with that country ever again. We're going to be in 2 blocks for the rest of my lifetime. And that to me just seems so sad that it's worth maybe, having to pay a bit more taxes. People of Taiwan, I know you don't want to serve in the military, but guess what? Too bad you live in Taiwan. You have to serve to protect the island. So there's sacrifices that are going to have to be made, but the alternative, in my view, is worse. And so I hope that that's where the debate is going, and we get the motivation we need to make the changes that are necessary.
ありがとうございます。
Professor Jimbo, could I make one comment just to add to that?
Sure, please go ahead.
One piece on the economic side in terms of a lesson, just echoing some of the things Oriana said.
Sure.
I just want to remind everybody that in the run-up to Putin's invasion of Ukraine, the consensus among bankers and oil companies and those that did business with Russia was this will be a small interruption, but basically there's too much interdependence here for us to cut off, particularly on oil and gas in Europe. That was the debate in February. I think it's important and instructive, and I hope Beijing is paying attention, that that turned out to be not true. It turned out that it was possible to reduce drastically oil and gas coming into Europe, and that they took the sacrifices that Oriana's talking about. Europeans have done that. And as a result, Russia is I have the statistics here. I think it's 106. They have significantly less resources today to fight their war than they anticipated. Thousands of companies left Russia willingly, not because governments sanctioned them, but because they said, we cannot do business with this barbaric country. And I think we need to remember that if China, unprovoked, invades Taiwan, at least in my country, it will be impossible for companies to say, well, that's some dispute they had a long time ago. It's not our business. There's no way politically that will fly. And I think that is very important to look at just how much economic dislocation happened with a country that was not integrated into the global economic world in the same way that China has. I think in the same way that Xi Jinping is motivated ideologically and he's willing to take economic risks of that, I think people are underestimating how much political pressure there will be. And I'm not speaking about Japan. I don't know the politics in your country. But when people are dying in Taiwan because of this horrible invasion, it will be impossible for American companies, banks, all of the companies that do business there to say, no, we have to move on. I think it'll be a very big dislocation that will have very deep economic consequences for the Chinese economy.
ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much indeed. I would like to speak for a couple of minutes myself, and then we would like to collect 2 or so questions from the audience. We also have questions that are being received beforehand as well. So those of you who have questions, please prepare yourself as I speak from my part. Now, I was asked by the Secretariat that I should explain about the salient points for Japan. The Russian aggression against Ukraine, the biggest implication for Japan is, as I have already mentioned, how can we be able to build the proper deterrence against such a situation happening in this region? And the Japanese people have opted to go for reinforcing our defense capabilities, and there is already a wide-ranging consensus on this. The so-called 3 strategic documents, which were published at the end of December, was the consequence of that. But what we have chosen is to catch up with China militarily or try to increase the number of the bombers or fighters. That was not what we have chosen for. What we have understood is that we are inferior as compared to China. We do admit that. We do recognize that. But trying to stop, to have a capability to deny China trying to change the status quo
To that extent, we would like to increase our capability militarily, or our defense capability. And as much as possible, we would like to expand what we can do ourselves. And that would be conducive to the deterrence of the region as well. And the U.S. is not free of charge, so to speak, extending its deterrence to Japan. We also have to pay for ourselves and jointly to move forward with the United States in enhancing our deterrence. So that is what I wanted to explain. And then I would like to ask one or two questions from the audience, and please be brief and concise. There are also several questions already received in advance, and some of them have already been answered during the discussion. What is necessary in order to advance Japan-Taiwan relations? Something like Taiwan Relations Act in the United States. Could similar legislation be possible for Japan? I would like to ask Dr. Mastro, in terms of relationship between Japan and Taiwan, what would you expect for the bilateral relationship? So later, I would like to pose this question to Oriana. But before that, anybody who would like to ask a question, please raise your hand. There is one person in the back and the another person.
Professor Eto, yes, go ahead. My name is Eto. I'm head of the Chinese group at Geoeconomics Institute. Thank you very much for a very insightful discussion. I do have a question for Dr. Oriana Mastro. From strategic rationality, you talked about deterrence. So I would like to ask you about your views, because in today's discussion, assuming a worst-case scenario to enhance deterrence, that need was advocated by you today. And as I am an expert on Chinese politics, China, in order not to be defeated, they are expanding their military capabilities and they're continuing on that path. So build-up of their defense capabilities is being enhanced. So when there is competition over military build-up, are there any chances of us being prevailing? Because authoritarian regimes, they disregard rationality to build their defense capabilities, meaning could be obstacles. So I would like to ask for your views on this point. And Dr. Suzuki, please.
Thank you. Ambassador McFaul and Dr. Mastro, thank you very much for indeed highly interesting comments. My name is Suzuki. I'm the director of Geoeconomics Institute. So a follow-up to what Professor Eto has said. As a deterrence, economic sanctions, to what extent was it effective? Ambassador McFaul, you mentioned already that we need to have proper deterrence, and for economic sanctions menu, we need to, in advance, clearly communicate and announce of this. To what extent economic sanctions would be effective as a deterrence? For economic sanctions, you have to have economic calculation to be fully established in order to be able to pose as a deterrence. But Russia, especially Putin, was not that actually influenced by economic rationale. So how can we utilize still economic sanctions as a deterrence? Do you have any advice, please? Thank you.
So changing the sequence, we would like to go to Dr. Oriana Mastro to respond. As was asked in the first question, U.S. and China, they are in competition to raise the escalation ladder. So what are the prospects of U.S. prevailing in this competition? And Japan and Taiwan relationship, what is it that you expect? So those are the questions for you, Oriana. And to Ambassador McFaul, economic sanctions as a tool of deterrence, how effective do you think it is? Those are the final questions. Can you answer in 3 minutes? I would like to ask you to conclude in 3 minutes, starting with Oriana.
Thank you. So the first thing I just want to say is I'm not sure I agree with the premise in the question about expansion, about autocratic regimes, and in this case, China not being rational about their defense spending. One of my primary complaints in the competition is that the Chinese seem to be much more pragmatic and rational in their spending than the United States is. One of the statistics I like to give is that the war in Afghanistan cost the equivalent of 10 Belt and Road initiatives. Many years up until the early 2000s, the United States spent more on its nuclear weapons than the Chinese spent on its whole military. The competition hasn't been because China's outspent us. This whole time, and even today, we have more economic resources, the United States alone, and most definitely the United States and Japan, than China does. They've been very entrepreneurial, however, in the types of military capabilities they build so that they don't fall in the trap of sort of being outspent the way the Soviet Union did. But I take your general point, which is there is no end to this. You know, I only have ideas about how to deter the conflict for now. But absolutely, anything we do, China is then going to have to go back to the drawing board and figure out how to counter it. If Japan and the United States clearly brings our forces together, so our Navy is bigger than China's, they might build more ships. They might seek a two-front alliance with Russia. If we put missiles in second island chain countries, they will increase the ranges of their missiles to take out those missiles before they attack Taiwan. But the point is, in my mind, there's no closing window. They're not going to risk losing Taiwan, and they have confidence in their ability to figure out counters. So it's not the case that we make an advancement, and then they're like, we have to invade Taiwan tomorrow because of this advancement. But they will figure out a way eventually. And all I can say is I hope for some sort of completely unpredictable situation in the world that makes this Taiwan problem go away. I don't know what that would be, but I don't have any ideas. I just have ideas about how to delay it. And then I'll say about Taiwan-Japan relations. In the United States, at least, I often put this in the camp of it has no operational impact, so we should not do it. So I wrote some op-eds for the New York Times when Nancy Pelosi went to Taiwan, when President Biden makes statements about defending Taiwan. If this just upsets China and it does not improve our military prospects at all, I do not support it. But when we were in Taiwan, I had a bit of a change of heart because what we learned from senior leaders in Taiwan is they felt like those political maneuvers increased the morale of the people of Taiwan to fight. And we do need the people of Taiwan to be able to hold off. So there seems to be some trade-offs. So for Japan, if you say to me, listen, if we increase our relationship with Taiwan and make some political changes in our support for Taiwan and institutions, or we call Taiwan by a different name, or we do all these things that obviously the PRC will be upset about, but this is what's necessary to get the Japanese people on board with the defense of Taiwan, then I would say we should do it. But if it doesn't actually change anything in terms of the operational picture, I think it's very provocative for little benefit.
ありがとうございます。それでは最後に
Thank you very
McFaul 大
much.
使お願いいた
Lastly
しま
but not
す。
least, Ambassador McFaul, please.
Well, I know our time is limited and I'm about to lose my voice, so I'll be brief. Even dictatorships have interest group politics. Even dictatorships have societal preferences that don't always align with the General Secretary or Mr. Putin. And I think what is striking, looking at what's happening domestically inside Russia today, is that economic elites, none of them think this war was a good idea. All of them are suffering, except one or two companies, state-owned enterprises close to the president. And that will be exacerbated, I think, in multiple ways greater in China, because China is so much more connected to the outside world. And so we're talking about a global depression, not a recession. From the statistics I've seen, if we're serious about sanctions, it will lead to a global depression that will also destroy the Chinese economy. And I think the clearer we can make that, that this will be the economic implication, the better chance we have of, as Oriana said, kicking the can down the road. Because Xi Jinping may be obsessed with his place in history. But there are, I know, many Chinese elites that radically disagree with his calculations. And so we want to make them understand the giant consequences of those actions. And I'm convinced that we do have the capabilities to put in those kinds of sanctions. We haven't even used the word embargo yet, but there are ways to make this very costly if we have the will to do it. And then second, would we credibly communicate it ahead of time as a way to enhance deterrence?
はい、ありがとうございました。
Thank you so very much.
おかげさまで、マクフォール大使、そして
Ambassador McFaul and Dr. Oriana Mastro,
大変充実した
they have given us a very rich, fruitful
だというふうに考えて
discussion.
おります。この議論ですね、
Now, this discussion
安全保障戦略論の中心を占める
will continue to be the center of security strategy discussion. So as to what the prospects we can have for the year, I think this served as a very important discussion starting point. Now, part one ends now. Once again, I'd like to thank Dr. McFaul, Professor McFaul, and Dr. Oriana Mastro for their great contribution. Thank you very much.
討論ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much.
大変興味深いお
That
話を
was
伺うこと
a
ができました。
very insightful discussion
それではですね
we've
ここでです
just
ね
had.
ひとまずですね
So we are now
15分ほどの
taking
休憩
a
ということで
15
皆さんよろしいでしょうか。ご着席いただけま
Ladies
した
and
でしょう
gentlemen,
か。
please take your seats.
それではお時間となりましたので、
It is
第
time
2
for
部に
us
移
to
りたいと
begin
存じます。
part 2 of the forum. So please be seated.
よろしいですか。それではモデレーターの筒井さん、よろしくお願い
I
いた
would
します。
like to hand over to the moderator, Professor Tsutsui, please.
Well, thank you very much, everyone, for coming to this session, second panel. My name is Keio Tsutsui. I'm a faculty member in the sociology department at Stanford University, but more relevant here, I'm director of the Japan program at Asia Pacific Research Center at Stanford. And on behalf of Stanford University, Freeman Spogli Institute, and Asia Pacific Research Center, we'd like to thank the Asia Pacific Initiative for hosting this event here, and especially for the Yomiuri Shimbun for helping with the organization and the reporting and all of that. So the second session is about democracy and authoritarian challenges. And I would like to challenge any event organizers in the world to put together a panel that is better than these two people to speak on these issues. We have two fantastic scholars to speak on those topics. So I'd rather really get started right away so that you will get as much insight from these two excellent scholars as possible. So much has been said about the recent decline in democracies and the growing challenges of authoritarianism in the world. And Larry Diamond here has written this book, Ill Winds, which has been translated into Japanese last year, I think, which was written a couple years ago. And in that book, he was very alarmed about the recent developments, and he talked about how this situation of democracies today might be the worst in the 40-some years of his career watching democracies and evolution of democracies in the world. So I'd like to start with this question to Professor Diamond about his observation of what's going on today. Given that it has been a couple of years, he wrote this book in the shadows, dark shadows of the Trump administration in the United States and all of those. China still very much rising. Ukraine war hadn't happened at the time. So I would like to ask Larry's views today, whether it has, things have gotten better since the time he wrote the book, or things have gotten worse. Putting in the recent democratic recession in the historical context, what are your views on the state of democracy today, democracies in the world today? And maybe you can talk also about what factors really contributed to the decline, and if there's a slightly upward trajectory right now, what have changed today?
So thank you, Keio, and it's great to be with all of you at this revered institution in American engagement with Japan. The world entered a democratic recession, I think around 2006, after a long period of more or less continuous expansion of freedom and democracy in the world, a very gradual expansion that began with the so-called third wave in the mid-1970s and then exploded in the late 1980s and 1990s, and then a kind of slowing down again. And around 2006, we started trending downward in terms of levels of democracy and levels of freedom. It's not that those levels are so much lower today than they were in 2006. It's that they've been creeping downward steadily since 2006. And the method of democratic demise in the world during this period has basically been by gradual deterioration. So, you know, if democracy, the quality of democracy starts deteriorating and anti-democratic forces start rising, it should be deeply worrisome to us, not only for normative reasons, but because it could mean that democracy in many of these countries will essentially disappear, as it has, for example, in Hungary, without much of the world fully acknowledging it. Let me say what has changed since my book was first published in English, and then what hasn't changed, okay? What has changed is that democracy in the United States is in better shape. And you ask what was contributing to the trends that I identified, the global democratic recession. One major contributing factor was the decline of democracy in the United States and our severe political polarization and the rise of right-wing illiberal populism. And its rise in Europe as well, and the retreat of democracy, as I mentioned, in Hungary. And the damage this did to the image of democracy globally, the sense that democracy was a system that worked, that was resilient, that was morally, I mean, no form of government is ever morally consistent, but, you know, had some degree of moral consistency, and increasingly we looked like hypocrites. And it was happening at a time when China was rising relentlessly in the last 3 decades or so, but particularly in this century, and when Russia seemed, quote, resurgent. Judgments about regimes in the world, regime legitimacy, which way the world is going, they're always comparative, right? People are always comparing their regime against other regimes and certain types of regimes against other types of regimes globally. And for quite some time, autocracy, even severe autocracy, in the form of the People's Republic of China in particular, just seemed to work better, to get more done, to believe in itself more, and to be more dynamic. Now, I think we can explore in greater depth, Keio, if you want to, why democracy in the US is not as much in crisis now as it was, frankly, during the 4 years of the Donald Trump administration, which were the 4 worst years for democracy in the United States in many decades, if not since the Civil War. But it's not only because Trump lost power, it's because we had a president come in who was more clearly committed to democracy. We made some important and promising political reforms that I talk about in my book at the state level, which is where I think we're going to get a lot of political reforms. And in 2022, even though a lot of the people who had essentially voted to sanction the effort to overturn undemocratically the 2020 presidential election in the Republican Party took control of the Congress, even so, they did so by a much smaller margin, and the extreme election deniers in the United States, in the states that really mattered, the swing states, were virtually all defeated. The other big thing that's happened is that authoritarianism doesn't look like such a great proposition today. I mean, Xi Jinping has just so massively mismanaged COVID. And, you know, then he turns on a dime all of a sudden and says, okay, you want me to open up? I'll open up. If 1 million of you die, and it could be 2 million, too bad. You asked for it. I repeat, I'm sorry, I don't say this because I'm an American nationalist or an anti-communist. I say this because Xi Jinping is who he is. Mao murdered, what, 30 million Chinese? No one really knows. You think Xi Jinping is not capable of that? I think that his image in the world now is more and more tarnished. Economic growth in China is severely impaired. We'll see if it recovers, you know, and how much. But the competition between democracy and authoritarianism doesn't look as depressing for the Democrats as it did just 2 or 3 years ago. And of course, as was noted in the last session, Putin has just catastrophically miscalculated. And I think that this gives us new means, Keio, to wage the argument that when you don't have checks and balances of some kind, even without, say, Western or liberal democracy, even if you don't have full electoral accountability, when you don't have some checks and balances and diffusion of power and constitutional processes, then unaccountable, power-hungry rulers are liable to make egregious and catastrophic mistakes. And this is not only a lesson we're seeing unfold now in China and Russia in a couple of different ways, but look what's happening in Iran now. I mean, Iran is really unraveling. The economy is a basket case. The regime is, you know, maybe got 20% of the population that support it. Large numbers of Iranian youth have made clear they're willing to die rather than live under this regime any further. Women have stepped forward and risked their lives to challenge this regime. Many of them have paid the ultimate price. Venezuela, you know, you've had at least a quarter of the population leave Venezuela because the Bolivarian socialist dictatorship has run the country into the ground. Now, what has not changed is some of the deeper drivers of the democratic recession. And to my mind, the single biggest one, which by the way doesn't seem to be as big a problem in Japan as in many other advanced industrial democracies, so if anybody can either tell me that's not true or explain why, I'd love to hear it. But the biggest problem, I think, is social media. I cannot tell you how much damage it's done to destroy the social fabric of truth and credibility and polarize society into tribal camps who don't have the same facts. I mean, 70% of the Republican Party, of reliable Republican voters, really believes, without any evidence, and with 80 different courts after the 2020 election, including courts with Trump-appointed judges ruling otherwise, 70% of them really believe that Trump won the 2020 election. And a lot of that is due to disinformation and social media. And we have not found a way to temper that, fight that, and win the battle for truth. The second thing is the corrupting influence of dirty money around the world and its corrosive effect on the rule of law in the United States and Europe and the quality of our institutions. Again, I don't know about Japan. Someone here can comment on that. And the third, and I'll close with this, well, two others. One has been deindustrialization in the United States and Europe, and the shift of manufacturing jobs to less developed economies, which has hollowed out the industrial working class and has not only just immiserated them or made life difficult for them in terms of their income, but it's been humiliating for them. Work is a very important part of identity. And if you lose your job, you know, you've kind of lost your moorings in a way. And then they see all these immigrants coming into the United States with no control of our borders, or at least that's the narrative. But right now, I really think we don't have control of our borders. And it's been a very fertile formula for for feeding this right-wing populism. So these factors really haven't changed much, and I think continue to make us very vulnerable in Europe and the United States.
So we can come back to U.S. democracy in a little bit, but as Larry pointed out, there were certainly very concerning trends. If you look at, and the people who make arguments about the decline of democracy, they use statistics from VDEM or Freedom House, and if you look at the historical arc of the democracy scores, it is still going up. And the decline in the last 5-10 years is really pretty much within the margins of errors. It's not to say that we shouldn't be concerned about the decline of democracy, but we need to have a more of a historical perspective in interpreting what has been going on in the last 10 years or so. And on that, there was some conversations about the meaning of the year 2022 in the earlier panel. And I'd like to think about the meaning of 2022 in terms of democracy in the world. Larry has already alluded to the relative rehabilitation of democracy in the US. And Frank, you have been following the sort of confrontation between democracy and authoritarianism really since the end of the Cold War with your book on the end of history. And one of the biggest, the biggest event, political event of 2022 was Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And in the context of the history of democracy, especially in that particular region, how do you characterize the Ukraine war and what happened after that, especially in terms of NATO's revival? It was dying, according to somebody like President Macron. But now it's expanding, it's going strong. So something really changed to consolidate the alliance of democracies. So what are your views on what happened in Ukraine and where it is going, especially in terms of European democracies?
Well, I think that there's really two implications of the Ukraine war. This was not a war really about territory between two countries that was really just of interest to Russia and Ukraine. I think that it had a much broader significance for the parties involved, and it should have a significance to almost everybody else in the world that cares about world order and how geopolitics is structured. So this gets back to the debate that Mike McFaul in the last session alluded to over what caused the war in the first place. There is a narrative out there that's pushed by especially people with a more realist bent like Henry Kissinger that would say that the war was driven in a way by the United States or by NATO that wanted to expand NATO up to Russia's borders, deny it a buffer zone that would be constituted either by Eastern Europe or by Ukraine itself, and that the Russians acted defensively. And I think that this is wrong for quite a number of reasons. I mean, first of all, no one was really interested in expanding NATO, although it was suggested that Ukraine and Georgia could join NATO at the Bucharest summit in 2008. It was clear that nobody really wanted to let them in for kind of obvious reasons. I think the real motive was one that Vladimir Putin articulated at great length. He wrote a very long 5,000-word article in the summer of 2020. Is that right? 2021, explaining that basically the Russians and Ukrainians are one people, that the collapse of the Soviet Union was one of the biggest historical mistakes, that all of these countries belong together under the same sovereignty. He repeated this in a long speech he gave just before the war began, a little bit less than a year ago. And if you look at these different statements, it's very clear that the thing that really bothers him is the whole post-war European settlement that emerged with the collapse of the former Soviet Union in 1991. And, you know, he was demanding not just that Ukraine not enter NATO, he was basically saying that all of the Eastern European members of NATO that had joined since the 1990s should also basically, you know, become neutral. So in other words, you know, what we used to call Europe whole and free with great pleasure because of the expansion of democracy was really what bothered Putin. And it represented not a security threat, but a political threat. Because if you could have an actual democracy flourish in a Slavic country that was part of the former Soviet Union, culturally very close to Russia, then why couldn't it flourish in Russia itself? And there was a liberal opposition, and I think that that was really the threat, to the extent that Putin was driven by insecurity. It was not military insecurity, it was political insecurity, and his cure for that really would be to undo the larger European settlement that had happened after 91. However, second big issue that really affects everybody in the world is whether a country can use military force to change borders and acquire territory. There was a very strong norm established after the Second World War that modern countries, or countries in general, don't do this. And by and large, you know, you had some exceptions like Iraq's invasion of Kuwait and so forth, but this was a norm that was broadly accepted. I remember the Kenyan representative who was on the Security Council, you know, at the time of the February invasion, gave this wonderful speech where he said, look, we Kenyans come from different ethnic groups. Our borders are completely drawn by colonial powers. They make no sense. But if every one of us, you know, wanted to use military force to change those borders, you know, we'd never be free of violence ever. And I think that that was a general view that everyone had after 1945, that, you know, at least you're not going to see big powers trying to take advantage of little powers in that exploitative way. And I think that that's really what's hit this country, because up until the invasion of Ukraine, you know, it was kind of plausible that these big powers are going to be prudent and, you know, think about their interests in this broader way. And then all of a sudden, here's one big country trying to grab its neighbor. And all of a sudden, I think for everybody here, the possibility that was always present, but nobody really believed, that China could grab Taiwan, suddenly became, you know, much more vivid, because you can see Russia trying to grab Ukraine, and you can imagine Chinese troops landing on the beach in Taiwan and doing what the Russians were trying to do in Ukraine. So that was the other big, broad norm, and I think that that's part of the reason why it's had the really amazing effect, you know, here that it has in other parts of the world. But I would point out that there is a little bit of myopia among the democracies of the world in sort of thinking that they have, so it's true. So I'm sorry, I didn't answer this part of your question. So the other thing that I think surprised people was the solidarity within the NATO alliance. I certainly wasn't expecting that. You know, your turnaround in defense policy was prefigured by the German Zeitenwende. Its reversal, you know, for 40 years they had an Ostpolitik that saw reconciliation with Russia to be central. There was a lot of war guilt in a certain sense that Germany in World War II had invaded Russia and they needed to have a good relationship. They had become pacifists. They were not going to be a military power. German young people were brought up under this assumption that never again would they fight another war. And all of a sudden, in February, they declared basically what you just declared. They're going to double their defense budget, and they're going to drop this Eastern orientation in their foreign policy. So all of this was really quite remarkable and very, you know, in a way reassuring about the strength and solidarity among democracies. But we sometimes forget that there's a global South out there, and a lot of countries don't buy into this narrative. So I think, you know, there are several big disappointments. One of them is India, and it gets to the question of whether the issue really is democracy versus authoritarian government, because there's no I mean, Prime Minister Modi has been eroding Indian democracy, but broadly speaking, India has been a pretty good democracy since its independence, and yet they don't take democracy at all seriously as a factor in their foreign policy. You know, they buy weapons. They used to buy weapons from the former Soviet Union, and they prize their neutrality. They never wanted to line up with the West. Country like South Africa is a democracy. It transitioned to a democracy in the early 1990s, but, you know, it was mistreated by democracies, including by the United States, by Britain, by other Western democracies because of the colonial legacy, and so they just don't, you know, regard solidarity with other democracies as a, you know, important dimension of their foreign policy. So I think it's a little bit of a mixed bag. I'm very encouraged by the solidarity that's been shown, especially, you know, here and in Europe, but we have to remember that that's not by any means the whole world.
I want to come back and dig deeper into the issue of democracy versus authoritarianism, whether that's the appropriate framing or not. But I don't want to let this moment pass without giving Larry a chance to talk about Taiwan and what it means to defend Taiwan in the context of defending democracy in the world. I know you feel passionate about this topic, so could you speak a little bit, linking this session to the earlier session, what does it mean to defend Taiwan in the context of democracy versus authoritarianism?
So when I left at the end of, I guess, 2021 as the co-editor of the Journal of Democracy after 32 years, I wrote, excuse me, I wrote an essay kind of reflecting on the long arc of democratic change during that period and the challenges ahead. And this was, I guess, 2 months before Putin invaded Ukraine, and Xi hasn't invaded Taiwan yet. But I said what I think was obvious then, that these were the two frontline states for the battle for global democracy, and that I felt much of what would happen in the world in terms of the future of democracy would involve, sorry, what happened in these two states. Could they survive as democracies under pressure and threat from these two great power autocracies or not? That question is unresolved in both of these two frontline states as we sit here, and as Frank has said many times, it is being tested on the battlegrounds in Ukraine at horrific human cost. Taiwan is a very vibrant democracy. You know, there are 3 liberal democracies in East Asia, Japan, Taiwan, and Korea. I think Taiwan is at least as democratic as any of them. It has a very vigorous civil society, a lot of innovation. Of course, it has deep divisions in the society to a degree that I don't think Japan does, because of the division over Taiwan's identity and Taiwan's geopolitical future. But if such a, there is wide agreement among comparative scholars of democracy that Taiwan is one of the great success stories of the third wave of global democratization. If that can just be wiped off the map, like Hitler wiped Czech democracy off, the Czechoslovakia democracy off the map, and essentially said in the late 1930s, or had the rest of the world say, nice little democracy you had there, it's a pity it can't survive. The same way we have essentially said, nice little kind of free society you had in Hong Kong, sorry it couldn't survive. If Taiwan can just be wiped out like that by the will and lust for power and domination of the most powerful authoritarian state in the world, what does that mean for the future of democracy and freedom? Now, I'm very worried about Taiwan because I think that I agree with everything Oriana said. There is going to be a PRC military invasion of Taiwan probably in this decade, unless it is deterred. And the three most important actors in deterring it are, of course, Taiwan, the United States, and Japan. And I think that successful deterrence must involve coordination among all three on strictly military terms, on not only increased defense capacity, but making sure that we buy the right kinds of weapons to counter a likely Chinese amphibious invasion, and to be prepared to impose such heavy costs on a Chinese invading force that she will say it's just not worth the risk. What else I can say is that democracy is about uncertainty. And there is a presidential election coming in January of 2024 in Taiwan. There is a battle going on for the soul of the KMT between an extreme and even anti-American, very accommodationist, deep blue camp within the KMT, and I'd say a more moderate and pragmatic faction of the KMT that I think is more committed to defending the country. And I would put in that camp the chairman of the KMT, Eric Chu, and the person who I think will be the KMT presidential candidate, the mayor of New Taipei, Ho Yu-yi. William Lai has the vice president who alarms and angers Beijing because he's seen as pro-independence more than Tsai Ing-wen, and has made a few statements that, taken out of context, can make it seem like he's another Chen Shui-bian who's going to try and inch Taiwan toward independence. I've met him and talked to him even fairly recently. I don't think he's going to do that because I think he's smart enough to see how suicidal that would be. But, this is, it's going to be another very important test. And China is going to intervene however it thinks it can in the Taiwan presidential election by trying to ensure that the DPP loses, trying to manipulate the information environment. I mean, Taiwan spends an enormous amount of money just trying to track United Front agents in Taiwan, Chinese Communist Party influence agents, and trying to counter Chinese Communist Party disinformation. And of course, if you're Xi Jinping, you'd rather pick up Taiwan peacefully than by force, right? So if you could get a sympathetic government in there that would start negotiating, and then you're on a different track, and over time you just kind of ratchet up the pressure more, and so on, that's definitely a preferable course. So there's a lot of uncertainty here, and I think it's going to be very important that the people of Taiwan see that they're not alone, that the democracies of the world, and now I would say not just the United States and Japan, but Australia and Europe are with them. And you know, it will increase the will to fight.
Wonderful, thank you. So going back to democracy versus authoritarianism, and as a social scientist, I'm tempted to talk more about the whether it is analytically accurate to divide all the policies in the world into two camps, and so one is democracy, the other is not authoritarian or autocratic regimes. Because today, there seem to be a lot of hybrid kind of models. People use labels like authoritarian democracy, illiberal democracy, democratic authoritarianism. There are all kinds of different kind of labels for these hybrid versions of polities. And you can talk about that as well. That'll be interesting to me. But perhaps more policy relevant issue is whether it is strategically wise to divide the world into two camps, as the United States seemed to be doing in calling the Democracy Summit last year. Because if you observe all these countries, especially Southeast Asian countries, African countries, we in the West would like to have those countries on our side. And to win their hearts and minds, it may not be the most effective approach to just preach them democracy. It's all about free voting. Because they need more of economic resources. They need to put food on the table. They care more about those issues. So in approaching those countries, I'm not entirely sure whether this framing of democracy versus autocracy is the best approach. So I'm wondering how you feel about that, and how what might be the best strategy in really winning the battle. I don't want to label one country as the only enemy, but China seems to be doing quite well, at least until Sri Lanka and Pakistan and so on, was doing reasonably well in making entry into those countries, at least at the government rulers level. So in winning the global South, which will be an important battleground for us, what would be the best approach?
Well, first of all, I think we need to make some definitions, because there's a lot of confusion in terms. When Americans use the term democracy, first of all, they usually mean liberal democracy. And liberal democracy actually consists of two separate sets of institutions that oftentimes go together but are conceptually and practically separate. So the liberal part of liberal democracy really has to do with a presumption of the juridical equality of, you know, all human beings, the existence of individual rights that those citizens have, and the need to protect those rights through a rule of law, through constitutional checks and balances that prevent an excessive concentration of power. The democratic principle really has to do with popular sovereignty and the idea that governments should be accountable to as large a portion of the population as possible, and institutionally that's represented through multi-party, you know, free and fair elections. And different, this is something I was thinking as we're getting ready for this panel, different parts of the world are more aligned with the liberal part, and some are more aligned with the democratic part. I would say that it's striking in Asia that Asians tend to like the liberal part more than the democratic part. So for example, in this part of the world, we use we want a rule-based order. We want a rule-based international order. That's not saying we want people to be able to vote for their leaders and so forth. What that means is basically we want a liberal order that establishes rules, limitations on the way that economic actors behave, that makes them predictable. And therefore, a country like China that has no elections can actually participate in a rules-based order. And I think, in this country, that's really been the kind of underlying principle of the free and open Indo-Pacific, right? It's a liberal order, much more than it is a democratic order. You're not going to appeal to Laos or Cambodia or even a democracy like Indonesia primarily by appealing to the democratic part, but you are going to appeal to them by stressing the liberal part. In Europe, it's actually, I think, a little bit the reverse, that democracy is really the source of legitimacy, and what's happened with the rise of populist regimes like Orban's Hungary is you get democratically elected leaders that... Well, no, he is Democrat. No, Larry, look. No, it was a democratic, in terms of the will of the people, it was not a liberal election that happened according to procedural, to strict procedural rules. There's no question that he got a big majority of the vote in Hungary, and then he used that power to undermine the liberal part of liberal democracy. This is also what Modi has done. Modi has been very popular in India, and he's been eroding the liberal part of liberal democracy. The populist movements in Western countries have largely been democratically legitimated, but they're not liberal, including Donald Trump, right? So Donald Trump, by our rules, did win the 2016 election, but he wants to use the Attorney General to go after his enemies, and he doesn't want to be. He doesn't want to follow the rules when he loses an election and so forth. And so there, I think you have a slightly different dynamic where the democratic part conveys more legitimacy, than the liberal part. And I think one further observation is just a kind of self-reflection about, Americans. American national identity has been connected to the idea of both liberalism and democracy much more deeply than virtually any other country in the world. And in fact, just think about Japan or Italy or, Sweden. These were all countries way before they were democracies. And, they've got their own cultures, their own, food, their own history that way preceded the rise of democracy. Japan was briefly a democracy in the Taisho period, but then really after the late 1940s. And so when I think people in this country think about what is Japan about, the first thing is not democracy. It's really a whole bunch of other, cultural inheritances. And I think that that's just not true for Americans, because we're an incredibly diverse, ethnically, racially, religiously, country. We used to be much less pluralistic, but even from the beginning, you had a big racial division in the United States, and therefore you couldn't base American identity so easily over time, on race, religion, inherited culture, because we basically didn't have an inherited culture. It all came from other places, and therefore liberal democracy becomes the source of American identity. And I do think that Americans sometimes have a problem in not realizing that not everybody in the world is like that, right? That democracy means something very deeply to many people around the world, as does liberalism, again, in different proportions in different countries, but as a unifying principle, it works in some places, and we should take, advantage of it, but in other parts of the world, that might not be the thing that you want to lead with. It may be economic growth, and certainly for many developing countries, in a way, that's kind of an argument for stressing the liberal rather than the democratic part, because in general, liberal regimes have been better at, promoting growth than democratic ones.
Yeah, you have.
I want to make a couple of additional points. As you've already heard, one dissenting point. The most important additional point, Keio, is it's not a democracy summit. It's a summit, it's not a summit of democracies, it's a summit for democracy. I think, and I was never that crazy about the initiative, to tell you the truth. When I look at how much of the person power and intellectual energy that the Biden administration has devoted to the future of democracy in the world, what a high percentage of that has been absorbed in just the planning for and agonizing internal debates over the Summit for Democracy. I'm not sure it was really worth it. But in any case, the framing, I think, was very valuable because it sought to at least partially avoid, maybe not adequately, the Cold War style division of the world into our side and their side. And we've seen in the UN votes on Ukraine and in a number of other things, the Indonesias of the world, the non-aligned movement, it's kind of back in a way. They're just not going to sign up to an initiative in which they have to line up behind the United States as pro-democracy against China, Russia, and so on and so forth. So that leads to my second point, which may get into whatever questions you have about what is to be done. I think we really need to fight for values. Democratic, and I would say to the extent we can, liberal values, but understand there's cultural differences in the world. But, our public diplomacy efforts have kind of lapsed in the United States. We still don't have a permanent Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy. I mean, it's really shocking. And we're not spending the amount of money in real terms on public diplomacy that we, which is everything from broadcasting to support for other international media and getting our story out and fighting for our values in international forums and so on, that we were a decade ago when the challenge wasn't nearly as severe as it is now in the age of disinformation. So there has to be, an element of pragmatism, a long-range view, trying to win a longer-term battle for what people think and believe, and a very vigorous battle to counter disinformation. Now, let me say why I think Hungary is not a democracy, because I think it's very important to understand this, particularly now in the world we are in. It's not enough for a government that emerges out of contested elections to have apparent majority support or even broad majority support to say, well, they had elections, more people in the country favor that party than any other country, so it must be a democracy. If that were true, we would call Singapore a democracy. And nobody is really calling Singapore a democracy. You've got to have at least a reasonably level playing field, which of course does not exist. It can't be perfect. It never is perfect. It's probably not even perfect in Norway. But you have to have a reasonably level playing field in order for competitive multi-party elections to meet, I'd say, a decent standard of democracy. And I think there's a fair amount of consensus among comparative scholars of democracy on this point. And I just will say emphatically, if you look at what Viktor Orban has done to gerrymander electoral districts, to crush independent media, to silence independent universities, to threaten intellectuals, to dominate the information space, you know, if he then wins as he did the last parliamentary election, and even gets you know, a majority of votes as a result of that, you still don't know what the electoral outcome would have been if there were a level playing field. And if there were a level playing field, I can tell you absolutely, no one has any doubt that for now, the PAP would still be ruling in Singapore, but would have a lot fewer seats than it has now. And there actually was an election where Viktor Orban got fewer votes than the opposition combined, but you know, he won a 2/3 majority of parliament because he had gerrymandered the districts so much. And I say all this not just because I think Orban is a particularly ominous danger to democracy globally, because he's become a rallying point against liberalism and for the enemies of democracy in the United States and Europe, but also because the demise of democracy is happening incrementally and often silently, step by step, in a number of countries in the world. And if we don't recognize this process of somewhat silent decay and the growing climate of fear and the unwillingness of businesses any longer to contribute to the opposition because the tax man will be at their door and all the other things we could talk about, then we don't understand what's happening in terms of how democracy is dying around the world.
We're probably not going to settle whether Hungary is a democracy or not right here, but I want to cover two important points that a lot of people in Japan are likely to be interested in. One is, where is American democracy going? And number two, what does this all mean for Japan and the Japanese public? American democracy, already Larry talked a little bit about what ails American democracy and some of the solutions, but if you have some more to add, well, gerrymandering is one actually factor in the US as well. And you have some suggestions in your book about rank order voting and other things. And Frank, on liberalism, you have an entire new book on liberalism that is going to be translated into Japanese version, I trust. And you, in the book, you lay out some problems, excesses of liberalism in the US, both in the right and left. So I'm wondering if you could speak to that issue a little bit more and talk about how that might shape the future of American democracy in the coming years. Maybe start with Larry, if you have things to add about American democracy.
Well, I'll say the following things briefly. First, the positive. I do think there are signs that we've entered an era of political reform in the United States. I'm sorry to inflict this statement on Frank one more time. The poor man has to keep listening to me say this in such a variety of settings. But I do think our best prospect for depolarizing our politics is by adopting the electoral system that Australia has for their lower house of the preferential vote, the instant runoff, what we call in the United States ranked choice voting, and also eliminating partisan primaries so that you just have one blanket primary. The field is narrowed down to a few candidates, typically 4 or 5, and then this instant runoff is used to choose a majority winner among those 4 or 5. I think that system would be much more likely to choose a less polarizing victor in a lot of kind of contested outcomes. And there's some momentum gathering for that. It was adopted in Maine in 2018 in different forms. This instant runoff preferential vote was adopted in Maine in 2018, Alaska in 2020, Nevada this past November. It's going to be possibly, I think, on the ballot in Oregon in 2024, and the state of Minnesota, it looks like, is going to adopt it legislatively this year. And also, a lot of American states have been adopting other reforms that I'd say are good reforms for democracy, to increase the number of people who are registered to vote by making voter registration a more automatic process, by restoring the right to vote to convicted felons, because in the United States, the racial, excuse me, the racial distribution of people convicted of criminal felony crimes is vastly disproportionate to African Americans and to some extent Latinos. On the other hand, what worries me is that even though I think Trump is a unique threat to American democracy, and it looks like his stock is falling, and I think Frank may want to say more about that. Sorry. I guess that cough medicine didn't work so well. Even though that's the case, I think that, I don't say this as a partisan statement. I mean, I also work at a conservative think tank, the Hoover Institution. But I think there are a lot of Republicans whose commitment to democracy is questionable at best. And there's a lot of there's a lot of anti-democratic sentiment among the MAGA base of the Republican Party.
Well, I think that there's been problems with liberalism in the United States that have been pushed both by the right and the left. The right-wing misinterpretation of liberalism is what we call neoliberalism, which was a set of economic policies that worshiped the market, that tried to remove the state from regulation, from state ownership or encouragement of economic activity, that really begins with Thatcher and Reagan, and really we're kind of at the end of that period that produced a lot of economic inequality. I think on the left, you've had this transformation of the left in many countries, but particularly in the United States and Europe, from parties that were based on class, meaning the proletariat versus the bourgeoisie, or poor people versus rich people, to one based on much narrower identities that had to do with race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, and the like. And in the process of that transition, it became, in the hands of certain progressive advocates, illiberal. That is to say, intolerant of people that didn't share that same social justice attitude towards these kinds of issues, and that in turn provoked a big reaction on the right. I would say that what drives most Republicans these days, it used to be low taxes, right, and government regulation, but in recent years, it's all been these cultural things that, they don't like critical race theory, or they don't like, transgender activists and this sort of thing. And so the nature of the politics has shifted in many ways to these kinds of cultural issues. And I think that that's what's screwing up American politics, quite frankly, right now. The right-wing part is being adjusted. I think that neoliberalism has been out, for at least 10 years now. The state is kind of much more prominent in terms of industrial policy, you know, protecting semiconductor supply chains and so forth. The progressive distortion of liberalism is a little bit more complicated because that's deeply embedded in you know, civil rights and our view of, you know, individual rights. And that, you know, continues to roil our politics. And for that, I wish I could offer you a simple solution of how to pull back from that, but I'm not sure I can.
Right. I'm sure there are a lot of people in the audience waiting for questions, and we'll turn to you in a moment. I just want to quickly ask about Japan. What can Japan do to contribute to upholding the international liberal order and democracies? Well, domestic democracy, as Larry alluded to, seems to be functioning reasonably well compared to other democracies in Europe and the United States. And Japan is dependent on international trade. Japan needs international exchanges of people, goods, resources, ideas to continue. And Japan is surrounded by authoritarian countries that seem to have strong appetite for more territories, more resources, and have powerful military, China, Russia, North Korea, and so on. So Japan, it seems obvious that Japan needs to contribute to defending of the international liberal order. And in that regard, what advice do you have? What can Japan do more of to make contributions in this regard?
Well, I mean, Japan has already done the right things, you know, at least in initiating, you know, so when the United States pulled out of the TPP, Japan took leadership and tried to revive it and keep the idea going as best they could, despite the fact that it lost its, you know, biggest original backer, and that was very helpful. And now in the security realm, you know, the planned increases in the defense budget, I think, are exactly what is called for to meet, you know, this new set of security threats that are, you know, very vivid and overtly military. And it'll be a question about, you know, follow through, as Oriana was saying. But that's that's a challenge I think that really all of us have. So I think Japan has done a pretty good job in all of this.
So I don't know enough about Japanese domestic politics to offer any advice to this audience. But I would like to offer this observation. I don't think it's quite right to say that Japan is surrounded by authoritarian regimes. It is, you know, maybe uniquely among countries in the world, well, not entirely uniquely. You want to know a country that's surrounded by authoritarian regimes? Mongolia, whose only two borders are with Russia and China. How'd you like to be Mongolia today? But Japan does face this extremely dangerous arc of Russia, North Korea, and obviously, especially, China. But I'll tell you when I think it will be much more accurate to say that Japan is surrounded by authoritarian regimes. And that would be if China conquers Taiwan. And then, you know, I'll just make this prediction. They're not going to stop there. Sooner or later, they're going to take the Senkaku Islands as well. And I keep saying, I think I heard Frank say it on this trip too, we've entered a kind of 1930s moment in this region where the overriding challenge is to deter and, if necessary, to defeat authoritarian aggression. Before the authoritarian regimes bent on aggression, but particularly China, become so powerful that it will be hard to stop them. And part of the tragedy of Europe agreeing to the Munich Pact that essentially signed away Czechoslovakia, and before that, just kind of shrugging their shoulders when Hitler simply completely overran Germany's commitments for demilitarized Rhineland and moved his military forces right there near the French border, is that Europe could have prevailed at much lower cost early on. And with each failure to act, the stakes became greater and the chances of success became lower. So even if all China does is take Taiwan, you know, what's it going to mean for Japan's ability to defend its territory? This is why, you know, I'm not going to name any names, but I have been struck. It's the single most important thing I've been struck by, that several members of the kind of political realm in Japan who have held or hold elective office have privately said to us that, yes, they consider Taiwan an existential, they consider ensuring that China does not forcibly take over Taiwan to be an existential issue for Japan. And I think now making that clear to the Japanese people and to Beijing has become a pretty important imperative for Japanese democracy.
Thank you. So Hosea-san has questioned.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I'm Yuichi Hosea. I'm a professor of international politics at Keio University, and also I'm a research director at API here. And I'm also a co-host together with Yomiuri Shimbun of today's extraordinary event. We have learned so many things from your talks, your gorgeous talks, and as Tsutsui-san mentioned in the beginning of this session, you are wise persons. That's why I suppose that wise persons can see or can foresee. Sometimes ordinary people cannot see. And so that's why I like to ask you, what is the biggest concern or worry about in Japanese democracy or Japanese geopolitical position today here? Maybe there are some points that we cannot see in Japan. Maybe you can see from the United States, and because Japan is another frontline state, together with, of course, Taiwan and as well as Ukraine. So that's why I think that we need to be aware of some of the problems or concern or shortcomings that we have in Japanese democracy or Japanese geopolitical position. So I'd like to know your wisdom about that.
I will repeat. I don't know enough about Japan and its domestic politics to give a very informed and even semi-confident answer to your question. But the most obvious thing that can be said is that, and this is not criticism of the LDP, some of the people we've met have been people who hold prominent positions in the party. And I must say, maybe I had a biased sample, but I found them to be very impressive individuals. So this is not a criticism of the LDP, but you know, whenever you have, it's the most obvious thing that's been said about Japan over the Japanese democracy over the decades. Whenever you have, you know, one political party largely dominating for 70 or so years, it's an area in which, you know, maybe one would want to cast some attention. So I think simply achieving more responsible and effective parties beyond the LDP is one obvious area. And then the second thing I'll say, with all humility, because the problem, I think, is no better in the United States, but I think many liberal democracies really struggle with the problem of money in politics. And I think that Japan and the United States struggle with it to some extent in different ways. I mean, in the United States, our Supreme Court has, to my mind, outrageously misinterpreted the First Amendment to gut congressional ability to regulate a lot of campaign spending that's independent of candidates. I'm sure the problem manifests itself in different ways in Japan, but I'd say reforms to somehow mitigate the influence of money in politics, and certainly to ensure absolute transparency in all flows of money into politics, you know, that would be a second thing.
Do you want to add or go to?
I don't know, I'm a little this is not a threat. I'm not quite sure whether this is the right place or time to say this, but in many ways, I think one of the biggest social problems that Japan faces is the one that former Prime Minister Abe identified. Your female labor force participation rate is way too low, right? And you know, compared to other developed democracies. And I mean, this is a subject for a much longer conversation, but I actually think that that's also related to the extremely low fertility rate in Japan, because I think that when you have a highly educated, fairly rich society with a lot of educated women, and you have that kind of socially conservative society, one of the responses of women is, you know, not to want to have a lot of children. This is not just in Japan. I think this is also the case in Korea and Singapore and many other, you know, Asian countries. And I think that that kind of social transformation, you know, needs to happen. You know, just for pure economic reasons, because you're underutilizing a really major part of your workforce. And so I would think that that's, you know, I mean, the low fertility has been recognized as a big vulnerability in Japan, but it's related to these other things as well. So as an outsider, that would be my, you know, my observation.
Thank you. Very quickly, Takenaka-san, a quick question.
Quick question. Since this session is on the rise of authoritarianism, I have been wondering, my name is Harukata Takenaka from Seisaku Kenkyu Daigaku in Daigaku groups. I have a question, like if you look at the situation in East Asia, the continental, I mean those countries located in the China Peninsula tend to be authoritarian, whereas island countries, except South Korea, Mongolia, tend to be democratic, Japan, Indonesia, Philippines, and Taiwan. So, but if you look at GDP per capita, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand are higher than Philippines or Indonesia. So what makes and you two have been observing these different type of regimes in many places of the world. What do you think makes it very hard for these South Asian countries on the Indo-China Peninsula difficult to democratize or sustain their authoritarian regimes? Thank you.
You know, these things, these alignments kind of change over time. In 1985, you would not have been able to say that maritime Southeast Asia is democratic, not Indonesia, not the Philippines. And with Thailand, it's a very puzzling country to me right now. But I will say that I don't think it's got anything to do with Thailand being on the kind of peninsular landmass or periphery or of China, or not that much. Obviously, the Chinese shadow is there; it's an influence. But when Thaksin Shinawatra rose up in the late 1990s, and then became prime minister, he really scared the devil out of the Thai elite and the Thai military. And I think it's important that we not glorify him. He was not a Democrat, in my view, but he was winning elections and doing it by mobilizing democratic electoral support. And I don't think Thailand ever really recovered from the military coup that displaced him. And then, that deep social cleavage between the countryside and the urban elite, or the, partly a class cleavage, partly an identity cleavage, it's just hung like a dark cloud over Thailand ever since. And it's not been able to get back. And the military doesn't particularly want to give up power. And I guess if I said this in Thailand, I could be prosecuted for lèse-majesty. But and since I'm going there soon, I'd better be careful. But I think the role of the monarchy recently has not been as, at times pro-democratic as it was at strategic moments earlier in Thailand. So I think that it's a lot of esoteric reasons, but we now have Anwar Ibrahim as the new Prime Minister of Malaysia. I don't want to glorify him as well, but you now have in Malaysia the most democratically, kind of philosophically committed to democracy individual who's ever led government in Malaysia. And I think, you don't know, they had one false start after UMNO lost that landmark election. But Malaysia could actually emerge as a democracy. So there's a lot of fluidity and uncertainty and possibilities in a lot of these countries. I don't know what to call the Philippines now. It's probably an electoral democracy, but of very low quality. Indonesia, I think it's pretty impressive that it's been able to survive as a democracy. It's got a lot of problems and challenges. The thing that strikes me is that a lot of these countries in Southeast Asia, obviously in the near term, that doesn't include Vietnam and Cambodia, but a lot of these countries could go in either direction. And I'll say one last thing that has been stirring in my mind for a long time. If Vietnam were a stock, I would buy it as a long-term investment, because I think it's going to be a democracy before China is.
Well, on that positive note, I'm afraid we are running out of time. So, and I apologize to those of you whose questions we couldn't integrate. And I'm going to turn it over to Sasazawa-san, but before that, please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists for their insights.
どうもありがとうございました。
Thank you very much indeed. It was very timely, and it was highly interesting discussion that we have been listening to. Once again, I would like to thank the panelists, especially from Stanford University, all the speakers, and also the moderators as well. Now, as for today's discussion, on the 17th, tomorrow's Yomiuri newspaper, the summary will be given, and then on next week, we will have the whole session to be presented in our newspaper. Now, we would like to end our session for now. And thank you very much once again. Please remind yourself to take all your belongings with you. Thank you.